Hello everyone. In this video lecture, we're going to summarize the major sections of Come Thou Tortoise that you had to read for this week. I'm going to do a chapter-by-chapter breakdown summary of this text. So you know that we're starting on page 99 on the chapter that begins "The next morning I came downstairs." Each of these slides is going to break down a certain chapter. First chapter that you had to read, then the next slide would be the second chapter, third chapter, and so on. That way, even if you don't have the same page numbers, I do make reference to where the chapter begins, or it's just the next chapter after the one I've just addressed. In the chapter, or the first chapter that you had to read for this week, that begins on page 99 and goes to page 110, we have a return to the young Audrey's perspective. She recalls, or the young Audrey actually narrates in the first-person present tense, her actions and interactions with Toph and her grandmother. She has been remarkably disrespectful towards her family members, or at least the people that are actually biologically her family that she doesn't recognize as such in Toph's case. The growing tension that is being fomented between them, and also the fact that Toph and her grandmother believe that Wilfred Moss, who is actually Uncle Toby, the actual man behind Uncle Toby, the real name of Uncle Toby, is taking advantage of her father, has led Uncle Toby to leave and take up residence at the Civil Manor. Now, it's probably the Seville. Audrey is just mispronouncing it in another one of her word games. But Uncle Toby leaves to stay there so that he can minimize the tension that's developing. As a result, Audrey and her father argue over whether Uncle Toby should be allowed to stay, and why Toph and her grandmother should really be the ones to go and visit a hotel. In my analysis of this chapter, we'll delve into some of the reasons for this perspective. Audrey and her father visit Toby at the Civil Manor, and he is left in charge of Audrey. The father departs to engage with Toph and her grandmother. Eventually, after she spends some time with Uncle Toby, Toby brings her back and leaves her basically on the front porch to her house. He then leaves and goes to a bar. We learn through this section, by implication, that Uncle Toby might have an alcohol problem. At numerous points, he is referred to as being a kind of pirate, and there are these allusions to the games of make-believe and fantasy that he plays with Audrey. One of the elements that enters into that fantasy is pirate sherry, so the drunkenness of pirates and the like. So even though we don't see it directly, there are a number of moments in this section of the novel that suggest to us that Uncle Toby resorts to drink when he is stressed. Later on in the novel, in sections that you won't read, this is really confirmed to us because after Walter's death, Audrey finds an entire drawer full of empty bottles in Uncle Toby's room. So by implication, it's never stated, but it is implied that Uncle Toby has a severe drinking problem. And that may be, in fact, why he is so reluctant to drive, as we'll see at various points in this novel. Because he has had some kind of accident or issues with drinking and driving when he was in England. Audrey sees Uncle Toby in this bar, but she doesn't really recognize what's going on. She doesn't recognize that he's drinking to alleviate the pain of being separated from the family and of being sort of cast out and rejected by Walter's mother and brother. Audrey then, after seeing Uncle Toby, secretly goes back to the Civil Manor and waits in an unoccupied room for him to return, hoping to surprise him. There, she falls asleep. In the next chapter, that begins, we are meeting Toph for lunch at his hotel, we return to a contemporary perspective on Audrey. So the modern, present-day Audrey begins narrating again as she goes to meet with Toph to discuss the will that her father left behind. The major theme of memory and its influence on present events, the mutually defining relationship between present events that call us to recall certain things and organize them or order them in the past, and the way in which the past then shapes our understanding of the future in this sort of cyclical, mutually defining fashion, is brought to the forefront again. Her experience in the moment as she is going to the hotel and waiting is a consequence. It proceeds from and it ties into those past events when she remembers staying at the Civil Manor, a hotel, waiting for Uncle Toby. So we see how the two eras of this novel are commingled and mixed together They're inextricably linked or woven together in this tapestry that is itself an illustration of how memory, the past, and the present all fuse together to define each other and help to give shape and logical consistency or ordered narrative to our lives. In this chapter, Toby and Audrey are really talking about their feelings, their experience of loss and grief. However, they talk around each other. They refuse to acknowledge the actual issues that undergird their conversations. As is often the case with them, their grief is too raw for them to actually engage with the issues at hand. It's revealed at this moment that Toby has an extensively long arm. He makes up this fanciful song when Audrey was young about to scrape is the job of the long-armed man. He makes up this game of being the one to scrape the car windshields because it's easier for him to do it with his long arm. Now, what this is in fact a representation of a real world condition known as hemihypertrophy. So one side or one part of his body is radically dimorphic. So it's larger than the other. So literally he has one arm that is much longer and larger than the other. This real world condition, we learn, is covered over by a game of make-believe and fantasy that they never have divested Audrey of. They've never allowed Audrey to exit from. They've convinced her when she was a child, or they told her when she was a child, that really he was kind of like Luke Skywalker. Luke Skywalker got his hand chopped off by Darth Vader and then got an artificial hand to replace it, filled with circuitry and mechanics. Walter Flowers and Uncle Toby tell her the same thing, that Wilfred Moss, the baggage handler from England, that is the fake Uncle Toby, lost his arm in an accident and then replaced it with a prosthetic. That means that the prosthetic limb, which required all of these servos, actuators, and wiring to function properly, simply took up more space than the human limb on his other side. Again, it's one of these fanciful games of make-believe that try to conceal the reality of loss, in this case a physical loss of Uncle Toby's arm, with something pleasant. Now, obviously, he didn't actually lose his arm, but it's all part and parcel of the same medical means of treating loss or obviating, avoiding loss. Just as Walter Flowers convinced her that the application of biogerontology will one day be able to prevent us from dying, so too here at this moment are they suggesting, through this game of make-believe and pretend, that Audrey can escape from the consequences of injury through the application of medicinal advances or technological advances in the form of this artificial limb. But really, it's in itself a representation of our inability to correct those things that are wrong with us, right? This condition, hemihypertrophy, that cannot be cured. It cannot be addressed. It's something that he has to live with. So couched in that narrative of Uncle Toby's loss or supposed loss is the idea that those losses can be corrected and that which was lost can be restored. So in a way, you don't have to experience loss at all. It's a thematic tie or parallel to the lies that they told Audrey about the evitability, the avoidability of death. As they begin to wait for Toph to arrive at the hotel, Audrey starts to worry about Winifred and displaces her fear and desire for connection onto the Tortoise. I'll provide more detailed analysis of these sections with examples. For right now, we're just going through this summary. Toph arrives and eventually discusses Walter's will and has a disagreement with Audrey regarding her father's character and his wishes. She insists that he never would have wanted a will. In the chapter that goes from page 122 to 125, we return to the narrator, the second narrator of this work, Winifred, and she contemplates her new existence with her caregivers in Oregon, Chuck and Linda. And she wonders if she should try to make an escape and find some way to get to Canada so that she can go after Audrey, or if she should replace Audrey with the current tenant. In other words, how do I deal with the loss of Audrey? Somebody in my life has departed. Do I find some way to replace them? Do I move on? Or do I keep pursuing the person who has departed? In a way, Winifred, as we've said, is a window into Audrey's situation. It provides clarity, almost like the ebb. Audrey's experience throughout the novel, her experience of grief, is a thematic parallel to the ebb, in that she is lost, she is meandering on this path that becomes less a path the further down it you travel. The more invested we become in Audrey's mind, her character, and her narration, the less clear and precise, incisive the narrative becomes because she is confused about so many things. Winifred puts the question out there directly. It's the question that anyone has to face, in essence, when they're dealing with grief, just like Audrey. Do I continue to chase after the person that's gone? Or do I try to move beyond that experience of loss? Do I find new experiences to take the place of that which has been destroyed? That question that Winifred grapples with, her experience of the loss of Audrey, and her question, will she ever return? Will I ever see her again? Or do I have to make these new people my new owners, my new tenants? That is really at the heart of Audrey's experience too. And because Winifred presents it to us in objective, specific terms, we're better able to understand the quandary or the conflict that Audrey finds herself in. Winifred also provides us with more explicit backstory information regarding Audrey. She recalls the previous tenant, Cliff, Audrey's former boyfriend, the rock climber who owned Winifred before Audrey herself. As he says, or as Winifred says, he left Audrey climbing the walls, and she then went on this cross-country trip trying to find him. He was one of the reasons that she moved to the United States in the first place. What we have there in the other flashbacks that we will have to, let's say, a 22-year-old Audrey, as she goes on this cross-country trip to try to find her boyfriend who left her, is another exploration of grief and loss. That quest to try to find him, the same quest that Winifred thinks about embarking upon to try to retrieve Audrey. So those flashbacks and those recollections that we're just getting little glimpses into because we don't have the full narrative yet, also offer us better insight into Audrey's contemporary experience. This person has left. In this case, Cliff has chosen to leave, chosen to break up with Audrey, and she chases after him. Where then do they go from here? In the next chapter, from pages 126 to 132, Toff and Audrey argue over the wording of Walter's obituary. And we have the first section of the funeral, wherein Audrey speaks to several people, oftentimes talking around the loss of her father. In the chapter that goes from page 133 to 141, the adult Audrey continues to describe the gathering after the funeral, and she exits her home. She steps outside of that symbolic or the setting representation of her family to find Toff. Now, this is an intensely symbolic moment, as the setting of the home represents her family. We'll discuss that in a little bit more detail as I draw together a few different parallels. Symbolically, Toff has kind of been excluded from the family. He has been cast out of the home, just as Uncle Toby was when Audrey recalls her childhood. That exclusion is also something that Audrey experiences. She doesn't feel like she's really a part of her family anymore because that family has been radically altered. So she steps outside to engage with this member who has never really been granted access to the home. And she imagines having a conversation between herself and her actual Uncle Toby, Toff, wherein they both apologize for their conduct over the years. Now, this conversation doesn't actually take place. It becomes lost in her own narration. Whether she's actually saying these things or it's all just in her imagination is somewhat ambiguous. Here, there's a difference in the way in which flashbacks take place. Usually, we flash back to the young narrating Audrey, the child Audrey, in an unconscious act of transition between chapters. So something in the present moment calls to mind something from the past, and Audrey descends into it. She loses control of the past and gets dragged into it. Here, the opposite is the case. This flashback into the past that takes place in this chapter, in fact, is a conscious choice on the part of the narrator. She retreats into the recollection of her childhood and recalls her father's attempts to find her when she was lost and the way in which she blamed Uncle Toby. And these are the moments, really, in which we learn that Toby has an alcohol problem. That idea of Audrey being lost is, in essence, her realization as she steps out of that home. It's a recognition of the feelings that she has as she steps out of that home symbolically, steps outside of her family. She's lost. She's looking for her father, and her father is looking for her because she's not there with the family. She's excluded, just like Uncle Toby was. So, on the level of setting and on the structure of the novel, in terms of how this transition from present day to flashback functions, we have an illustration of her sense of isolation and the reality that she's experiencing a segregation from the family that really doesn't seem to exist anymore. Her past, as she was sort of excised from the family, visiting the hotel, and her father is desperately questing after her, trying to bring her back into the home, is a reflection of her feelings at the moment. And she deploys that consciously at this moment as an attempt to explore and to understand her experience. The next chapter, from page 142 to 146, Audrey continues to reflect on her experience after the funeral and adds to the commentary in the setting of the pond behind her home. We'll delve more into that setting with specific examples drawn from the text, tying together these sections and the earlier section that I asked you to analyze from pages 1 to 49 in our first class that we didn't really get to discuss in detail. Judd Brown, who is basically a Christmas tech employee who sells Christmas lights and other decorations, comes to her home and asks to speak with Walter Flowers, unaware that he has died. He believes Walter is still alive and wants to recall Christmas lights that were sold to him that they realize are being recalled due to a manufacturer's defect that could result in a fire. Audrey speaks to him, but simply tells him that her father is not home. We'll talk about why that is when we come to our interactive class and we discuss this chapter in more detail. In the next chapter, we have the final moment in this section of the text that I asked you to read for today. Verlaine is assisted by the assembled guests at the funeral to help her jumpstart her car. So they push the car down the road, and she is able to depart the funeral in this car that had to get a running start. So the assembled guests push the car down the road to get it up to speed, and then she's able to get the engine to turn over and depart. And really, the entire chapter is oriented around their interpersonal interactions as we lead up to this communal activity of getting the car to go. In the ensuing video lectures, I'm going to be delving into a few of these first chapters, tying things together, exploring the setting, the use of setting in this text, and also reflecting on some close readings of the first few chapters.